Hello, friends, and welcome into another episode of Marriage Talk. Bill Hobson here, along with Jay and Laura LaFoon. You can find out, by the way, all of their information, events, and insights at jayandlaura.com. And last week, we had a really fun conversation, an important conversation about communication. We got to hear some examples of times when all three of us have blown it in our own worlds. And it kind of dovetails really well into this week's conversation, which is about conflict resolution. So we've made the mess. The Lego pieces are scattered across the living room floor. And instead of continuing to step on them in our bare feet, we need to clean up this mess, right? We've got to make some sense out of what we've messed up. Conflict resolution. How do you want to start this conversation, Jay and Laura? Because it can go a million different directions.
Well, I think we'd like to cover maybe three areas. The first being family of origin. The second being conflict style that is mostly a result of your family of origin. And then third, give them the two phrases that will definitely de-escalate any argument. I mean, immediately put water on the flame. And the first is family of origin. And you just can't, I don't care if you grew up next door neighbors to your spouse and you live next to each other your entire life. You come from two totally different families. Now, Laura and I are the epitome of that because she grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, a urban, southern sweetheart belle, Piers the Driven Snow. And I grew up in Petoskey, Michigan. We're talking back in the day, these little northern Michigan hick town. And so we came from two very different families, two very different upbringings. And as a result, that again plays in conflict because like Laura said last week, her family, they're a bunch of yellers and screamers. And Laura's like a little Chihuahua dog when she gets going. She's like nipping at my heels. And I'm just like, hey, we'll talk about it later. And then later I'm like, well, let's still talk about it later. How about later we talk about this? How about
He'd just rather let it stew than to talk about it. And then he'll get mad, a month from now, and I won't even know what he's mad about.
And what she really hates, for those of you that are on YouTube and can see it, is when she starts yapping at me, I just smile. Sorry about that. I just smile. And that makes her even more mad when I smile at her.
Well, it's not only family of origin, but it's also Kevin Lehman did a book years ago called The Birth Order, and it's where you fall in your family. And I think that's huge. Jay is the firstborn. He's the firstborn son, firstborn grandson, the firstborn golden child. And I'm a middle child. We're the forgotten ones. Yes. And so I'm also, though, as a middle child, I'm the peacemaker. Kevin Lehman will tell you that middle children make the best spouses because we want to make sure everybody's happy. We want to make everything calm, cool, and collected. Even though I'm a screamer, I still want everything to be calm, cool, and collected. And Jay just is
firstborn. I want it done my way.
Firstborn, it's his way or the highway. And so we really had to learn that about each other. That reading that book was huge for us because I realized that I gave in a lot. I didn't really say what I wanted to say. I would just let him have his way. But then I'd be angry 2 months from now about something else. But really, it was because I had suppressed all that, just let him do his thing, even though I didn't agree with it or whatever. And so really understanding who you are and how you conflict,
and how you were raised.
Right. And what your family was like. Jay's family, they didn't talk about anything and they didn't conflict about anything. There was conflict.
We talked all the time.
Yeah, they talked all the time, but when there was conflict, you just kind of sweep it under the rug and we just don't deal with it. And so that's the way he deals with conflict in our marriage.
And part of that was because my dad was a minister. And so conflict was, that's not holy to argue. It's not righteous to be in disagreement. So we're just going to forget about it. Well, that's not healthy either. And so, yeah, that family, how you grew up and what you observed about conflict and how your parents handled conflict and how extended family handled conflict. Christmas was always, is always one of the best indicators of what your family's really like is when you're around relatives for a few days. So Bill, where do you fall in the birth order?
Yeah, here's the unique variation on the theme. My sister and I are both adopted. So I believe the story goes, I was an angelic 6 weeks old when I was brought home by Bill and Mary Hobson from an adoption agency in Detroit. 4 years later, they went back and got Kendra, my sister, not blood sister, but my sister now, of course, who is 4 years younger than me. And all through our upbringing, I would always tell her that we saved the receipt so that she had better listen to everything that I asked her to do. And so that was a wonderful time for both of us coming up. And thankfully, we are brother and sister. We are super duper close. Neither of us could ever imagine having different parents. However, we don't really know how that all is impacted birth order wise, but she would be the baby and I would be the big brother, and would like to think that while I certainly have blown it at times as the big brother, I'd like to think that I'm that protective big brother. Now, when you move into the older years and I start to think about marrying Ellen, we've now been married for 30, almost 35 years. She grew up in a family of 5 kids, very godly parents, farming family, dirt road. Her dad, who passed away at age of 99, lived in 2 houses his entire life, went to one church the entire 99 years, and moved basically 2 houses away. So that was it. Cole Road, Reading, Michigan, down to earth, God-fearing people going
And
out.
where was she in the birth order?
She's the baby.
Ah,
Going out to eat for them would be a luxury. Meanwhile, up in the middle part of the state, here I am, the son of an auto dealer. I would say fairly affluent, and eating at home would be a rare occasion for us. We were just, because all the schedules were just kind of crazy. So we come into our relationship from different, certainly different family backgrounds, different economic backgrounds, and from a communication standpoint, she and her siblings talk about everything. Still do. It's wonderful. And in our house, we didn't really talk about anything. We didn't talk about anything. There were words that are very commonly used today to describe body parts and functions that if they were to come out of my mouth at the age of 11, I would have been tasting the Lifebuoy soap for quite some time. So communication and all that. So how does all of that go into the cauldron and get stirred up when it comes to conflict resolution? And I think that's probably what you're getting at when you talk about family of origin. All of you listening right now have a unique story. My motto at my company called Hobson Media is we tell your story, because everybody has a different story.
and Bill's not going to tell his because that's the way he grew up.
Now I'm going to run into a tight 52-minute recap of my story. So all of this plays into how you interact with your spouse. I guess that's the long-winded way of saying, if you're wondering how that conflict can ever just appear, sometimes it just appears because it's how you're made or how you were raised. And it's not necessarily because of the person sitting across the dinner table from you as being such a miserable human being. Sometimes you're just predisposed to responding in ways that if you sat back and looked at it from a distance, you would think, oh, that's not what I meant to convey at all.
Right. And what that family does, that family gives you a conflict style. And there are actually 5 different conflict styles that people possess. The first is the attacker.
We talk about this a lot in our coaching course that we do with couples, and it's always fun to watch them go, oh, that's me.
Yeah.
That is, because we don't think to identify how is it that I conflict? I mean, I can say I am a screamer, but when you put a name to it, I am
The attacker.
the attacker. I am going to attack, and I'm going to make sure that you might wear a scar or two because of it.
Right.
I mean, it's not in my brain thinking that I do that. It's just the way my house was. It's the way my home was that I
Right.
grew up in. And so
you've got your attacker. I'll name them all, then we'll maybe talk about a couple. Your attacker, you've got your yielder. They're going to yield for peace. You've got your avoider, which is very different than yielding. It's just, I'm going to not even yield.
Not even engage.
Then you've got your fact checker, and then you've got your winner at all costs. And I tend to be a fact checker and a avoider. And so when we get in an argument, I start listing the facts. Here are the facts. Listen, you got to listen to the facts. You can't argue facts. And then she'll just be, oh, yes, I can, because and so she's the attacker with a little bit of
a little bit of yielder.
Yeah.
I will yield at some point.
The winner is the one you don't want to be.
No.
Because the winner is, I am going to win this argument at all costs, even if I hurt you deeply. So those types of conflict, when I see her starting to attack, I try and ask her, what's the root of this? Why are you? And when I start spouting out facts, she's like, don't you care about my feelings? And I have to realize that facts and feelings are two separate things that we really need to take into consideration both. Yeah, that might be the fact, but I still feel this way when that happens.
And when he tries to avoid and tries to just ignore the conflict and ignore that it's happening and I'm just going to leave this, I don't want to engage in this. I have to pull him back in and say, you know what, this is important enough for us to discuss. I know you don't want to, and it's not going to necessarily be an easy conversation, but it's going to benefit our marriage in the long run. And so you have to, identifying how you conflict will help you understand when you're in the middle of the conflict. You can start to see yourself. You go, I do not attack as much as I used to. I probably yield more than I ever have before. I hear myself. I hear and unfortunately I hear it in my siblings. And so when I hear it in somebody else, I go, ooh, I don't want to do that. And so I stop and I pull it back. And the more you can identify those things, then you can begin to change. And I don't necessarily think the yielding is the best way to do it. But I find myself
that is your
yielding
middle child.
more. That's the, whatever's going to keep the peace. I'm not going to, whereas early on in our marriage, I was much more of an attacker than I am now.
And, I oftentimes would use facts to hide behind the fact. I would use the facts to hide. I'm going to hide behind the facts and not recognize that we have an issue in our marriage and it's causing conflict. And that conflict is not healthy. Granted, you forgot the milk at the grocery store. Granted, you didn't, do this or do that. Granted, here's all the facts. Can't argue the facts. Well, that's irrelevant when you're really talking about the fact that does it really matter? And that's the thing that you have to ask yourself is what I'm really upset about going to matter in 100 years? Because if it's not going to matter in 100 years, then why in the world are you getting so upset about it? Because there are things that are going to matter in 100 years. You know what I'm saying? How you raise your kids is going to matter in 100 years. Your relationship with God is going to matter in 100 years. How you
put the toilet paper on isn't going to matter in 100 years.
Because we all know it goes over the top. Let's just be honest, okay? That's clear communication on how that. But all of that stuff. There are some things that will matter, but most of what we get upset about really won't matter in 100 years. Whether we do Chinese or Italian tonight ain't going to matter in 100 years. It might matter later on tonight with a little indigestion or something, but who knows? So understanding what you're bringing from your family, understanding your conflict style are two good steps towards de-escalating conflict. And again, we're not perfect at it, and we don't claim to be. They're just certain things that sometimes just set you off.
And I think there's the potential for a listener right now to think that we're dealing only with those inconsequential surfacey conflicts, but that's not really the point of all this. We really don't care if your toilet paper goes under or over.
Right.
Don't care if the kids have pancakes for breakfast on Friday because dad's in charge. Doesn't really matter. But we start to look at some of those long-lasting topics of conflict, like how we're going to spend the money that we work very hard to bring in. What's an acceptable purchase without consulting each other? How are we going to handle that kid of ours who keeps getting in trouble at school? What are we going to do with the parental issue with the in-laws are now beginning to try to tell us how to raise I mean, now we're talking about things that are a little bit more substantial.
I'm not comfortable with how your coworker is flirting with you. I mean,
Yeah. What do you mean I can't look at your phone?
right, right. I mean, stuff like that is yes, we conflict about a lot of minor things, but those big conflicts, they're going to come at some point in your marriage. They're going to come.
And that's why we talked about this last week. Having that 15 minutes of uninterrupted conversation every day helps you build that habit and of having the conversation about those inconsequential things. You have that habit in your repertoire of this is how we're going to discuss things when things do blow up. And also understanding your conflict style, where you've come from, helps you when you have those little inconsequential things and you can handle those, then when the big thing comes, you've got that habit built of handling it in a timely and effectual manner rather than letting it go nuclear, and become something bigger than what you really want it to be.
And it's funny how we can lie to ourselves. And I think that's the source of a lot of conflict, is that we've bought into a lie for ourselves, and our spouse is now exposing that lie, and we're uncomfortable with that. You picked a really good one. What do you mean you want to look at my phone? Well, we've convinced ourselves that whatever we're doing on our phone is okay, but deep down, we know we don't want our spouse looking at that phone. Or what do you mean I'm wearing too short of a skirt to work? Well, I'm not comfortable with you wearing that to work because, man, you look good. And I know that there's a guy there who really likes you. And we've convinced ourselves now he's just a friend. No, these are dangerous landmines that we're stepping around. And one of the big ones for us early in our marriage was money. We were in youth ministry, and so we didn't have money, and you could multiply that by 2. It was, and Laura did not understand budget, and that was partly her upbringing. And I'll never forget our 10th anniversary. I had secretly saved up a healthy amount of money for us to take her on a 10-year anniversary weekend. It wasn't going to be a week. It was going to be a weekend. Actually, probably
wasn't enough for a week.
It was probably even one overnight in Chicago. But I was so proud of myself. And I went to the travel agent, which you did back then, and I got a bunch of brochures. And we sat at the kitchen table, and I laid out the brochures, and I laid out all this cash that I had saved. Mm-hmm. And she broke down crying like she never had in our relationship, because she had hidden from me the fact that she had accumulated some credit card debt. And the debt that she had accumulated was exactly the amount of money that I had saved. And it was devastating for both of us, because she felt so bad that she had racked up this debt. And I felt that I could have been vindicated and could have just, tore her apart. But I was checked, thankfully, and just said, no, this is our issue. Yes, she's the one that spent the money, but we stood at the altar and said, for better or for worse, thank God we've got the money to cover it. No, we're not going to go on a 10-year anniversary trip. Okay, that's not the end of the world. We've got the money to cover the problem. And so she had convinced herself that she could make up the money somehow. And just like anything with money, it got worse and worse and worse. Yeah. So we convince ourselves of lies. I deserve this. I don't deserve that. Or, and part of it is we start deceiving ourselves.
And by the way, I think for everybody seeking to avoid future conflict, let's take that particular example, Jay, because in some respects, in an immature relationship, you could bring that moment up for the next 20 years.
It's been 26 now. I use it all the time. No, just kidding. I'm just kidding.
It's been 26 years, 7 months, and 4.
That's it.
But who's keeping track at home? How about the part of conflict resolution that forgives and then marks as off limits the conflict, so that it's not used as a weapon down the road?
Okay.
Yeah, that's called forgiveness. And it's the hardest thing to do. When your spouse does something that hurts not only your heart, but your relationship and the trust that's been built. And that's where we have to forgive like Jesus forgives, and we're not Jesus. We're human, and it's hard to forgive like that, but we have to forgive and forget. And I know in our marriage, I've had to, Lord, just, I'm forgiving him, and now just take it out of my mind. And it's a constant, don't let me bring it up. Don't let me think on it. Don't let me dwell on it. And that goes for anything that's hurt in your life, is that forgiveness has to be, I can remember growing up, well, I can forgive, but I'm not going to forget. Oh no, you have to forget too. You have to forget. Jesus forgave our sins, and he forgets as far as the east is from the west. That's like infinity. And so you have to forgive, and you have to forget, even though those moments are going to come back where you go, ooh, but you have to go, Lord, just take it out of my head. And that, somebody listening may go, well, that sounds really easy to say. It is easy to say. It's a lot harder to do. But it's what we have to do in order to continue to build this marriage that the Lord has given us in a way that brings glory to him.
And one of the things that it's so counterintuitive, but it's scriptural. In James, there's a passage of scripture in James that says, forgive so that you might be healed. See, when we forgive, it's not about healing the other person. It's so that we can move on and have that scar heal. And I think that is a profound yet very counterintuitive thought. I have to forgive so that I can heal. And no, I want to hold on to that. And the longer we hold on to it, the bigger the scar. The longer we hold on to it, the worse our condition gets. So when we can forgive, and especially in this relationship, this husband-wife relationship of, I need to forgive that, and I need to move on, because we said for better, for worse. And right now it is worse, but we're going to make this thing go.
Well, and I've talked to women all over the country where they, they're asking me, well, my husband did this 10 years ago, and he did this 5 days ago, and he did this. What good is you remembering? What good is remembering all that doing for you? It's doing nothing but making you bitter. It's making you hurt. It's bringing back the pain. It's reliving the pain. You've got to forgive, and you've got to forget, it goes right back to that passage of scripture, because when we can forgive and forget, then we're healed. We're not dwelling on it. The bitterness goes, the hurt goes, and you have to let it go. You can't remain a victim of whatever it might be the rest of your life, because you're not going to go past it. You're not going to move past it. You're not going to grow past it. And your relationship and your marriage isn't going to grow past it.
Yeah, and let me offer just a slight variation on that theme and see if the two of you agree with it, because I think that from a human standpoint, the actual forgetting is not easy to do. You will always be able to be reminded of the infidelity, for instance, right? You're not going to forget that happened. But how about the phrase being forgive and no longer hold against? Is that a fair variation on that? Because there are some things that you're
not going to forget it, right?
If I've been ripped off by a business partner twice, and I'm still willing to forgive that person and whatever, I'm not going to send them to prison, or I'm using some bizarre hypothetical. It doesn't mean that I'm going to forget that happened, because that would lead me back into another bad contract with that person. I'm going to remember that it happened, that I probably shouldn't take that same path again, but I wouldn't necessarily hold it against that person. I heard it described that bitterness and unforgiveness is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to get sick.
Yeah, that's a great illustration. And I would totally agree with that you're going to forgive and not hold it against. You're going to allow that person, what you're doing, you're giving grace. Mm-hmm. You're giving grace to that person. I'm offering you something that I've been given, and I use grace every day, because I am a sinful, fallen man. And I'm going to extend that same thing to you.
I do think using that no longer hold against is probably a better phrase to use than the word forget, because we'll just go back to the credit card debt and our 10th anniversary. We didn't forget that it happened, but what we did was we put things in place to make sure it didn't happen again.
Yeah.
So you can't put things in place if you forget it. So you have to put those things in place. I to this day don't go to the grocery store without a list. I have the list on my phone. I shop the list because that's how I got us in debt. Was Walmart and Target were my favorite stores. And so for that person, that marriage that has experienced infidelity, you're not going to forget, because you need to put things in place, those safeguards in place to keep it from happening again, whatever that might be, building the relationship, keeping track of each other, those kinds of things. I can't think of them all off my head right now. But
there are safeguards that are out there.
You don't really forget, because you need to move forward in making sure that these don't happen again.
And lest anyone think that this is a new phenomenon, okay? Billy Graham, for those of you that are younger, you're not going to necessarily know, one of the greatest evangelistic people ever. I mean, he was known as the pastor to the presidents. I think it was the first one was John F. Kennedy, and he was a pastor to all the presidents. Well, when he and his team traveled, they were not allowed to have a hotel room by themselves. They had to have two men in the hotel room in everywhere they went. Why? Because they know temptation's out there. So that's a safeguard. So there are many things you can do that will safeguard your marriage. Giving your spouse permission to look at your phone whenever they want. Things like that, to ask them, where were you? I know when I first started speaking, I got a cell phone before cell phones were even affordable. And
it was really a bag phone
because I wanted Laura to have access to me whenever she wanted. Yeah. And then we began this habit of, I'd get done speaking and go back to the hotel room, and I would call her and say, what are you watching? And I would turn on the same show so that we would have conversation about that show, just simply because we needed safeguarding. There's too many temptations out there. And whether it's money or intimacy or even family that can cause these things. I mean, you can't believe the number of stories we hear about families causing deep hurt. And it just, but
it really does go back to that. No longer hold it against. You have to forgive, and then you can't hold it against them. You can't bring it back up. You can't throw it in their face, because then that just causes more pain, and you haven't really forgiven. When you're doing that, you haven't really forgiven your spouse for whatever that might be.
So Bill, let's turn the corner now and talk about ways to de-escalate these conflicts, because we're going to get in them, and we don't want to avoid them, but we want to de-escalate them to the place where we can have rational, quality conversation. And the first phrase, again, it's a tool we want to get out of, is to simply say, help me understand why you did this.
Or said this.
Or didn't do that, or didn't say this. For example, using Laura and the credit card, help me understand why you did this. And through tears, through just agonizing tears, she said, I just can't help myself when I go to Walmart and I see something, I want to get it. And so that
for the home, for the kids, always had a good reason.
It was always a good reason. Oh, we need it. The 18th type of Tupperware that there is, that kind of stuff. But again, what it did for her was she verbalized it. What it did for me was it helped me understand her better, and that she did come from a home that was not wealthy at all. They were always wanting. And now that she had a little money, she wanted to exercise that freedom. Same thing when it comes to infidelity. Help me understand why you're flirting with your coworker. Well, I'm not feeling, I don't think you think I'm pretty. That can be a real reason of having that.
Or at least he looks at me. He acknowledges me. He says, you look nice. You don't ever do that, whatever that might be.
And so to use that phrase, help me understand, and then let the person answer, because generally speaking, as rational adults, we do want to walk through this. We don't want to stay broken, or that's not the right word. We don't want to stay dysfunctional. And if you do, that's just, wow, really? Okay. But we want to get functioning again.
And the other phrase is, do you know how that made me feel? Or do you know how that makes me feel? Because you got two choices. Yes, I know how that made you feel. Then you realize that your spouse is not a nice person, or no, I have no idea how that makes you feel. And that's more than likely the answer is no, I didn't know that the words that I said made you feel that way, or what I just did made you feel that way. And then you can work through that from there. Just like with, let's just keep using Laura's credit card debt as an illustration. You know, Jay had saved all this money. He was so excited. He was like, do you know how it made me feel when I have to now use that to pay off your debt when I really wanted to do something for you? And you know, that was crushing. He was so excited. He had done this for a year, saved this money, and I had kind of taken the wind out of his sail. And I didn't understand because I didn't know that that's what was going to happen. But you know, I didn't know how it made him feel.
And really that whole side of it, the feeling side of it, it's hard for guys. I'm just gonna be, it's hard for one of the two of you, because one of you is a more feeling generated person. Generally that is the ladies. One of you is less feeling person. Generally that's the men. Now in our relationship,
it's any given day.
Right. There's some days I'm just a big girl, you know, and I'm just nothing but a big ball of feelings. And there's some days where Laura's like, suck it up, buttercup, you know, get over it. And so it varies, but to really, I don't think we set out to intentionally hurt our spouse. And like Laura said, if we do, then there's some serious issues at play that need more than a podcast. They need some serious counseling. But, you know, for those of us who are just trying to make it through the day and let our spouse know how much we care without, you know, messing things up, we don't intentionally try and hurt our spouse. But oftentimes we don't know how it makes them feel. I did not realize my father, and again, this goes back to family of origin. My dad was a minister who was in the military. Okay. I do nothing without fear or guilt. Okay. I mean, that's just how I grew up.
You do it on time.
It's exactly right. No, we do it early. We're always early. Okay. And my dad, you know, he had a big booming voice. Like I've got a big booming voice. And I never realized that big booming voice was intimidating to my wife. And, you know, I could, with my tone of voice, make her feel 2 inches tall, and never realized that I had done that. Do I desire to do that? No, I wouldn't think any husband would desire to do that, but I did it. And so I had to realize that I had to work on that because of the way it made her feel. Was that my intention? No. And I could have said to her, well, I didn't mean to make it feel that way. Get over it. No. These are real feelings that she has that we have to process. And so asking those two questions, help me understand, do you know how that made me feel? Really can take that explosiveness out of discussions and then make it very rational and very productive.
Let me add one to that list, just real briefly, because it connects last week's conversation with this week's. And that is in those three major areas. And Jay has mentioned these since we've started doing the podcast together: money, sex, and family. In all three of those major pillar categories, have a preemptive conversation. Like, you know, honey, we've been married 11 years. We've never really talked about how we handle money, what we give to the church, what our spending thresholds are. We just never had the conversation. We just always seem to argue about it because there's never enough, but maybe we should actually put a plan together. And maybe it's a Dave Ramsey plan. Maybe it's just a common sense plan, whatever it is. Have that conversation so that as these moments come about where you have an opportunity, you have a need, you had an unexpected crisis come up financially, you come into that as a team ready to handle it together. You talk about family stuff before you get to Thanksgiving with 48 in-laws.
Exactly right.
23 of whom you don't really care if you ever see again or spend much time with because you just want to watch the Lions game. Have a couple conversations about maybe the signal I'm going to give you when I have reached my threshold and I'm tugging on my ear over here, which means you need to take me outside for a walk or whatever.
Yeah.
So do some homework ahead of time and into the category of sex. And I'm sure we'll talk about intimacy in future episodes in more detail, but in that category, have the conversation about your frustrations or your expectations or what you just dream of, what you wish. And so that it's not left until it's sort of like probably a terrible analogy, but the right time to buy hurricane insurance isn't after your roof has been torn off.
Right.
Mhm.
It's before it comes rolling in. So maybe, I don't know, you guys can tell me, but maybe that's why last week's episode and this one tie in together, because I don't think you can get a handle on conflict resolution if you don't also have a desire to get a handle on communication.
And what you're doing is you're making a preemptive strike. You're
Yeah.
you're dousing the flame before it even becomes a flame when you have talked about those things. And I think there's, I can say for certain that when we talk about money, it's uncomfortable. It's not always, because we have different ideas, but we come to a consensus. Same with family. If my mom had her way, we would have dinner at her house every night. And that is just not acceptable. And I'm going to tell you the biggest area, it was the hardest area, but the biggest area that worked for us was when we started talking about our sex life. When we started having honest conversations about expectations and what's fair and what is reasonable. And when we sat down and did that, it changed everything in our marriage, not because sex is so important, but intimacy is a crucial part of marriage. And if you don't talk about it, it will become an issue in your marriage.
And that's why, and we said this last week, and I don't know if we've said it today, but that's why we beat that drum of 15 minutes of uninterrupted conversation. Those are the conversations that you have. Excuse me. That's where you have those conversations where you look ahead and you go, Thanksgiving's coming up. Excuse me.
Yeah,
Give
when the 8 o'clock bell rings, I'm out of here. Okay, you just need to know that's my line of demarcation with the family.
His wife.
And to say that up front, and then she might say, "We know that's really not fair. Could we stay till 8:30?" Sure. It sounds petty, but if Uncle Bud is chewing my ear and I'm the only one who he has to talk to, and for the last hour I've listened to Uncle Bud, then it's not fair to make me stay till 10 o'clock at night. So yeah, those conversations are huge, and conversation and conflict go hand in hand. So do the best.
And when Uncle Bud when he gets to the Roswell chapter, 9. All right, folks, you have your assignment. Here's your first assignment. As you wind down listening or watching this edition of the Marriage Talk podcast, now go have that 15-minute conversation uninterrupted. And when your spouse looks at you like, did you just get hit in the head by something? Just tell them it's an assignment and that you'd like to make it a regular part of your time together. And you might even consider offering up the phrase, I wish we had been doing this a lot more often, so let's get better at it. And see what kind of doors that opens up for you. We appreciate you listening. And a reminder that every episode of Marriage Talk that we've ever done is available on our website for free at marriagetalk.org. And every week we bring you a new conversation and special guests and hopefully the topics that are most important to all of you. A reminder that you can join our Facebook page, Marriage Talk Facebook page, as well as subscribe to the Marriage Talk YouTube channel, and then share the links to the podcast, to the videos with other couples in your lives so that others can kind of dive in to get some of these practical insights that help make those happily ever after years together even more obtainable. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you again next week.